Hello everyone, it's Daniel from TechMind Factory and welcome to this new video from the series called Modern Identity powered by Azure. In this video, we are going to talk about home realm discovery with Azure AD B2C. If we want to support local accounts, it's simple with Azure AD B2C. There is a login page, we have to provide login, password and some additional details about the user. But what about the situation where we want to use Azure AD B2C as a single gateway where users from different kinds of identity providers can sign in and access applications secured by Azure AD B2C? This will be the topic of this video. So let's start. Let's start with login with external identity providers. When we federate Azure AD B2C with other external identity providers, so when we build this trust relationship between Azure AD B2C and external identity provider, we can display multiple buttons on the login page. And this is basically what we can see on the left side of this slide. There is Contoso employee button, but there can be also XYZ employee button and so on. User can click the button and user is redirected to the specific identity provider's login page. So underneath, user is redirected to the authorization endpoint of external identity provider. And this approach is good, however, there is a challenge. And let's talk about it. I'm not sure if you heard about NASCAR problem. NASCAR problem is about too many branding icons in a user interface like third-party sign-in logins options. So on the right side we have such NASCAR problem example, but this can be also about, like many other external identity providers, like the custom ones. So in the Azure AD B2C world, you can try to imagine the situation where you have different kinds of external identity providers you would like to federate with. So for each of such identity provider, you will have to add a button on the login page. So you can end up with NASCAR problem. It is called the NASCAR problem because of these clusters of third-party icons, brands on the login page resembles the sponsorship stickers covering the NASCAR racing cars. So it's funny, but yes, it's basically like this. It's a problem because such clusters of buttons cause both visual noise and people to be confused. There is also direct information displayed about federated identity providers, which is not always wanted. And this is really important because when we talk about B2C world, when you display all those buttons on the login page, people can see like, okay, so this specific application and this specific Azure AD B2C tenant is federated with XYZ, with Contoso, with Fabricam, and so on. But maybe your clients that you work with, they do not want to display such information directly on the login page. So it's not always wanted to have those buttons on the login page. Okay, so in such scenario, and with all those challenges, we have something what is called home realm discovery. So, what is home realm discovery? Home realm discovery, or HRD, is the process that allows to determine which identity provider a user needs to authenticate with at sign-in time. So basically, it works like we provide email address and then the identity provider is discovered using the domain part, and user is redirected to the authorization endpoint of such external identity provider. When a user sign in into Azure AD B2C tenant, they type a username or UPN, and Azure AD B2C uses that to discover where the user needs to sign in. So this is what I mentioned. So using the domain part, we can basically decide where user should be redirected to login and return to the B2C. So, in this video, we are going to talk about simple HRD flow or simple home realm discovery flow and advanced. So let's talk about simple HRD flow first. How does it work? Basically, as you can see, there is a user. User is using specific application. Application is secured by Azure AD B2C. And as we can see, when user clicks login button inside the application, user is redirected to the Azure AD B2C login page. And now on the login page, user basically provides the username or email, to be more specific. And now underneath, Azure AD B2C calls HRD API to check the domain, to verify it. So as you can see underneath, we have SQL database, and in this database, we have information about external identity provider. So we have the matching between domain and identity provider that should be used to sign in specific user. So when user provides email, then Azure AD B2C calls HRD API. HRD API verifies the domain in the SQL database, and we have the information about the IDP name, so identity provider name. And this name is returned to the Azure AD B2C, and because of the fact that we have configuration for federation stored in the custom policies, Azure AD B2C can decide which federation or which identity provider should be used, and user is redirected to the login page. So this can be standard Azure AD, Auth0, Keycloak, or any other external identity provider. And once user is successfully authenticated there, we have the set of tokens returned to the B2C, and B2C returns the tokens to the web application. And user is successfully authenticated. However, let's talk about some thresholds of this approach. So, as I mentioned, configuration is stored in the custom policies. So, as we can see here, we have this REST profile, so REST technical profile inside custom policy. And as we can see, the input claim is email. So basically, we will use email to pass this information to the HRD API, and HRD API will check the domain part with the database and will be able to return the IDP name or identity provider name, which will be used by the Azure AD B2C to make the redirection. So here is the REST technical profile. As we can see here, we will call the HRD API. We will pass email as a parameter, and as an output claim, we will get information about the IDP name basically. So the output claim is IDP. So basically, once we have this response from the HRD API, we have different orchestration steps in the user journey. And for instance, if IDP output claim is Azure Active Directory or AAD, then we will execute AAD Contoso OpenID Connect technical profile. So as you can see, here we have precondition, and if IDP matches AAD, then we will call AAD Contoso OpenID Connect technical profile, which is what we can see currently on the screen. So all the details about federation, like client ID or client secret, have to be stored on the Azure AD B2C side. So this is the technical profile for AAD Contoso OpenID Connect. So the client ID is here, response type, scope, response mode, and so on. So the whole configuration, including output claims, transformations, and so on. If we need more federations, we have to modify custom policies, obviously. So even if we have this HRD API, which will decide which identity provider should be used, still the configuration for the federation is stored on the custom policy side. So it can generate some problems. One of them is the maximum policy file. Yeah. So if the policy file will be too big, we will not be able to upload it to the Azure AD B2C. So you can try to imagine the situation that if you have so many different kinds of federations to be supported with Azure AD B2C, you will have to provide all those technical profiles in the custom policy, as we see on the right side. So the size of the custom policy can be really increased really quickly. On the other side, there can be a challenge with configuration, because as I mentioned, to configure this federation, we have to modify custom policy. So maybe there is a better way, so we can, delegate this federation handling on the API side instead of storing this configuration directly in the custom policies. And this is the topic we are going to talk about further in this video. So, as I mentioned, there can be a better way and more advanced way. So here we are going to talk about advanced home realm discovery flow. And this flow is more advanced, is more complicated. Custom implementation is required on the API side. There is more work also on the API side. So I want to underline this. But this flow has its own big benefits, and we will talk about them in a minute. But let's start with the simple authorization code flow here. So let's explain it again, just to make sure that we are on the same page. So when we click login button in the application, we are redirected to the authorization endpoint of the Azure AD B2C. We signing in there, we provide username, password, and then the state and the code is returned to the application. So authorization code is returned to the application. And then we take this code along with some other parameters like client ID and client secret, and we go to the token endpoint to exchange the code for a token. And if this operation is successful, then we get a set of tokens like ID token, access token, and refresh token. So let's talk about this flow. In more details, basically. So what is happening underneath here? So we start with calling authorization endpoint of the B2C. And as we can see, it's get, HTTP get. We have to provide the client ID, the response type, which is code. We have to provide the redirect URI, so where the code will be returned, the response mode, which is query. So it will be returned in the query string. We have to provide the scope, the state, and also because of the fact that we use code flow with Pixie, we have to provide code challenge and code challenge method. So once we go to the authorization endpoint and we successfully authenticate, as a response, we will get code and state, basically. And with this code and state, we will be able to call the token endpoint. So it's really important, like there are two steps: authorization endpoint to authenticate user, get the code, and now let's use token endpoint to exchange the code for a token. And this is this operation is HTTP post and with content type form URL encoded, basically. And here we have to provide the client ID, the client secret, if this is a web app, grant type, so authorization code, the scope, the code that was returned, redirect URI, and the code verifier. And this is used for Pixie, the last one. So once we provide all these details, in the response, we get the set of tokens, basically. So this is the authorization code flow explanation, really quick. So now, why I'm talking about it? Because using this information, this schema, this approach, we can build advanced home realm discovery flow. So with advanced home realm discovery flow, we have only one federation technical profile in the custom policy, which I will show you. So basically, instead of having those multiple profiles that will be called based on the IDP information returned from HRD API, we will have only one technical profile, which will call HRD API, and then HRD API will handle the whole exchange we discussed in a minute before. So let's talk about it here. So user is clicking login button in the application, and then user is redirected to the B2C, basically. On the B2C side, user provides email. So only email is required here. Once the email is provided, we click login button, and then what is happening underneath, Azure AD B2C calls authorization endpoint of HRD API. And HRD API is verifying domain. So again, we have this domain verification here. So we have SQL database where we store information about federations. So once we verify the domain, we have the information about IDP federation returned from the database to this HRD API. And now what's happening here underneath, basically this HRD API will basically return 302 HTTP response, so redirection response to redirect B2C to authorization endpoint of the identity provider we store in the SQL database. So what will happen here, we will build authorization endpoint URL on the HRD API. We will return it to the B2C with 302 code, basically, so redirect. And B2C will make this redirection to the specific identity provider, like Azure AD or Auth0. And now here, user will authenticate. So here, there will be login page of this external identity provider displayed. User will provide username, password, maybe user will use MFA, and so on. And once user is authenticated, the authorization code will not be returned to the B2C. Authorization code will be returned to the callback endpoint of HRD API, which I will also show you in the code. So instead of returning code here, the authorization code will be returned to HRD API. And what will happen on the HRD API side, we will update the session for this identity provider. So we will store the code in the database basically, and we will return the session state. So what's happening here, we store authorization code basically, and we from HRD API, we return this code to the Azure AD B2C, again using 302 HTTP redirect response. So what will happen here, B2C will get this code, and again, B2C will call the token endpoint of this HRD API. Because as I mentioned, B2C does not have any information, direct information about identity providers, because this information is stored in the SQL database, and HRD API is responsible for handling this code exchange, token exchange operations. So B2C will call the token endpoint of HRD API. We will get information about the session from the SQL database, and we will call the token endpoint of the external identity provider. And we will exchange the code for a set of tokens. So now what will happen, our external identity provider will return tokens to the HRD API again. And what we will do here, we will extract the claims from the external tokens, and we can do it in the custom way. We can just get the claims we really need to include in the token that will be returned to the B2C. And here we are building the token or set of tokens, like ID token and access token, that will be returned to the Azure AD B2C. So what we will do here from HRD API, we will build the token or tokens, we will sign them with the certificate that is stored in the HRD API, and we will return those tokens to the Azure AD B2C. And Azure AD B2C obviously can use those tokens and claims to generate own token, like ID token and access token. And those tokens will be returned to the application. End user is successfully authenticated, and inside the token, we can see which identity provider was used to log in. So let's talk about some details here. Let's talk about the database. So there are basically two tables required. Identity providers table, and as you can see inside this table we have information about federations basically. So now instead of storing this information on the Azure AD B2C side, on the custom policies side, we store this information in the SQL database. So we have a few columns here. So we have the obviously unique identifier, the name of this federation, federation partner name, description, the client ID and client secret that we obtain from the external identity provider, OpenID configuration endpoint of this external identity provider, domain, which we will use to match and use the home realm discovery, and also created on and modified on. Those are additional columns that we use to just audit the data and see when the record was created or modified. On the other side, there is authorization sessions table, and this session is this table is used to keep information about the session for the external identity provider authentication. So once we redirect user to the authorization endpoint, there is initial session created for this specific operation, and here in the authorization sessions table we store information about the identity provider ID from the identity providers table. We store client ID. We store identity provider authorization code that was returned from the external identity provider. We store return URL, so where the code should be returned, response type and response mode, and the state. And also there are two additional columns created on and modified on just to check when the record was created or updated. So with those two tables, we can basically implement home realm discovery, advanced home realm discovery. Okay, perfect. So I think that's it about the theory. Let's see advanced home realm discovery in action. Before I will launch HRD API, let's talk really quickly about the database and configuration. So as I mentioned, we have two tables, identity providers and authorization sessions. As you can see here in the identity providers table, I have my home Azure AD B2C federation information, and this will be used between Azure AD B2C and home realm discovery API. So to make sure that Azure AD B2C can communicate securely and use authorization call flow with HRD API, we have to provide this information here, like the client ID, client secret, and domain. So here is the configuration for the integration between Azure AD B2C and home realm discovery API. And as you can see here, I also added one federation, one external identity provider federation, so which is Azure Active Directory, the standard one. And it's called TechMine Factory and Azure AD Federation. As you can see, there is client ID, client secret, OpenID configuration provided, and domain, which is this one. So each user with this domain will be redirected to the authorization endpoint of the standard Azure Active Directory owned by TechMine Factory. And on the authorization sessions table side, as you can see, we have information about identity provider, the client ID. There is authorization code also, which is null for now because it's not completed. There is return URL provided and so on. So with such configuration, we can move on. To sign the tokens, I have the certificate here, and I used basically the Key Vault in the Azure cloud to generate certificate with the private key. So as you can see, here is my TMF HRD certificate, and I downloaded it and added it to my API. That's the second thing. And the third thing is that here is my configuration on the B2C side. So probably you are wondering like, okay, so how it's connected, how this connection between Azure AD B2C and HRD API is built. So this is my technical profile, HRD OpenID Connect. Yeah? And as you can see, this is home realm discovery login. The metadata here for the OpenID configuration is provided, the metadata endpoint. So this is the endpoint of my API. And to test it on the local host, I'm using ngrok. So I make this redirection to my computer on local host to make sure that I can debug easily and check the model and properties at each state of authentication. And as you can see, here is my client ID. This client ID is in the identity providers table. So this is my home Azure AD B2C. This is this information about the federation between Azure AD B2C and my HRD API. The response types, so code, scope, OpenID, profile, email. Response mode is form post. HTTP binding is post. And basically, there are some other properties included to make sure that this federation will work properly. And as you can see, there is also HRD client secret included, which is then used when there is a code exchange, basically. So client ID and client secret is provided. And as you can see, as an input claim, I have only one claim, email. So this claim as a login hint will be sent to my HRD API. And basing on the email, domain part, I will make this redirection. Why? Because in the database, I have information about the domain and federation details for this domain. And as an output claims, I want to get a few claims basically. So I want to get the federation partner name here to make sure that I know from which external identity provider this user came from, and some other details, as you can see, like tenant ID, given name, email, display name, and so on. And basically, you can modify those claims. I mean, like on the HRD API, you can add more claims and then map them in this technical profile. So, as you can see, here is Home Realm Discovery sign-in technical profile. And this is the self-asserted technical profile. So on the login page, there will be the control displayed where I can provide email, and then I will call this Home Realm Discovery API. So in the user journey, you will see that here I have only one button, Home Realm Discovery. And when I click this button, then the sign-in page with email text box will be displayed, and once I provide the email, I will be redirected to the external identity provider. So let me show you how basically it works. So let's get back to the Visual Studio, and here I will launch my HRD API. As you can see, there is also OpenAPI definition, so Swagger. And for instance, when I will click OpenID configuration, you can see that accordingly to the OpenID standard, I have the response body. So I can, for instance, check authorization endpoint here, the token endpoint, where I can find keys that are used to assign the token and verify token, basically, who is the issuer, and so on. So this is basically the standard OpenID specification here. And yes, there is a local host for the issuer because, as I mentioned, I will use it for tests on the local host, but basically you can change it to whatever you want basically. But this has to be publicly available address because B2C will call this OpenID configuration endpoint to get, as I mentioned, information about authorization endpoint, token endpoint, and basically information about the signing keys for the token. Okay, perfect. So as you can see, here is my API, and on the API side, I have authorized endpoint, authorized callback endpoint, token endpoint, and the OpenID configuration endpoint, which I describe in a minute, and the endpoint to get the signing keys used for the signing token operation. So when B2C is calling authorization endpoint, which is calling HRD API, the authorized endpoint is called basically here, and it's get, HTTP get, and basing on the properties from the identity providers table, HRD API will build the redirect URL and will return this to the B2C in the 3 or O2 response, and B2C will redirect user to the authorization endpoint. And let me show you that in a minute, but there is also this callback endpoint. So what will happen once we successfully authenticate with external identity provider, we want to get the authorization code back, but we don't want to return this code directly to the B2C because B2C doesn't know anything about this external identity provider, yes, because we delegated this to external HRD API. So this code should be returned to our HRD API. So that's why we have this get authorization callback endpoint. So here, external identity provider will return the authorization code. So now, once we got this code, again, we can return this code to the Azure AD B2C. So Azure AD B2C can make this redirection to the external identity provider with this code and exchange the code for the token. But what will happen here, basically, B2C will not call external identity provider directly. B2C will call the token endpoint, again, of HRD API. B2C will provide the code in the request, and HRD API will call external identity provider instead of B2C. So HRD API will exchange the code for a set of tokens. And then HRD API will include all the claims in the token that will be signed with the certificate I showed you, generated by Key Vault. And then tokens will be returned to the B2C, and B2C will map the claims from this token, and B2C will return tokens to the application. Let me show you that really quickly in the implementation. So as you can see, here is my HRD controller, and this API is not yet fully implemented, but the whole concepts are already there. So as you can see here, let me close this one. Yeah, as you can see, here is my authorized endpoint. And basically, once I will call authorized endpoint here, HRD API will build the redirect URL to the external identity provider authorization endpoint. And we will return this in the location header. And we will use 302 HTTP code. So B2C will be able to redirect user to the right identity provider, external one. Here is also the authorized callback endpoint. As I mentioned, this one is used to receive the code returned from the external identity provider. Yeah, and we will return this code again to the B2C. So that's why we have also redirect here, as you can see. So basically, we will redirect this specific code to the B2C, and B2C will call our token endpoint of HRD API to exchange the code for a set of tokens. And again, here, basically what we will do, we will call external identity provider with this code. We will get the set of tokens, and then we can map the claims. So when I will open, let me show you that really quickly. When I will open HRD services, authorization service, that's the one I use here. You can see that here is the method called call authorized endpoint async. And basically what is happening here, there is authorization request sent from the Azure AD B2C. Yeah. And as you can see here, from the email, we are extracting the domain part. And basically using the domain part, we will check the federation. There is also identity provider because we want to check whether the client ID that was used for federation, let me find it really quickly, HRD, yeah, this one, whether this client ID that we use here on the custom policy side matches the client ID in our database for the native federation. So now, if it's not registered for any reason, unknown client or not enabled error will be returned. And please note that there is a standard use to return OAuth errors, like there is error description, state also return. So this will be returned to the B2C. So as you can see, then once we verify the client ID that was sent by the B2C, then we are getting the identity provider by domain. So here is the part where we will check the identity provider details in the database basing on the domain part of the email used by the user. So if the identity provider is null, again, identity provider not registered, error will be returned, access denied. But if identity provider is found by the domain part, we will create authorization session. So here we will store client ID, identity provider ID, redirect URI, response type, response mode, and state. And this authorization session will land in the authorization sessions table. So, as you can see here, we call get discovery document async on the HTTP client, and we are using external identity provider OpenID configuration endpoint. So this is why we need this information in our database for the federation. And now once we got this response, we can get authorized endpoint from this. And once we have the authorized endpoint URL, we can create authorized URL. So we can provide the client ID of the client ID for the federation application registered in the external identity provider. We can define the response type, mode, redirect URL. Basically, we can provide the state and all other parameters, like for instance, scope. So once we build this authorized endpoint, we are returning this URL basically. So the HRD API can return it to the B2C, and B2C will redirect user to this external identity provider authorization endpoint. Now, when user is successfully authenticated, we will receive the authorization code. But this code will not be received by B2C directly. This code will be returned to this HRD API. So what we will do here, we have to handle this operation. So we will try to get the code and the state or the errors if there are any. And if there is any error, we will return it. But we want to also get information about the session. So as you can see, we will extract information about the session using the state. So once we have this session, we want to update authorization code for this session, for this external identity provider. So we will assign the code return to identity provider authorization code property, and we will update this record in the database. And this is required because, as you probably know, there can be multiple sessions handled by HRD API, and we want to make sure that we keep the state. So that's why we have to store this information in the database. So basically here, again, we are building the redirect URL with the code and the state. And this will be also returned to the B2C, and B2C will use this URI basically to call the token endpoint. And the token endpoint of HRD API, not the external identity provider. So that's why we have to handle token endpoint here in authorization service. So we have token request here. And as you can see, again, we have to extract details like the grant type, the code, the client ID, client secret, redirect URI. And here we have to get information about the client. So that's why, again, from identity provider repository or identity providers table, we have to get information about the client registered for external identity provider. So here we have information about the authorized client, yeah, and basically this is used to make sure that only authorized clients can be part of this whole authorization flow. And if we scroll down, we can see that we get information about the session. We extract information about identity provider using the ID from the session, identity provider ID to be more specific. And then again, we call discovery document, get discovery document async method to get the information about the token endpoint. This time, not authorization endpoint, but the token endpoint this time. And here we have to provide request parameters. So the code, the client ID, the client secret, this information will be retrieved from the identity providers table. And basically, once we get the tokens, once this operation is succeeded, we can get ID token and we can extract claims from this ID token, basically, as you can see. And also what we will do here, we will use signing credentials. So here what will happen, we will use the certificate I showed you to sign newly created token. So here, as you can see, we generate the token that will be returned to the B2C. And this token will be signed with this certificate. And this token will contain all the claims from the basically from the external identity provider token. And this is the part I mentioned to you, like this is the place where you can decide which claims you want to include, you don't want to include, you want to modify maybe. So this is basically this place. So once we build this token, as you can see, we can return the access token, the one that was returned by the external identity provider, and the ID token basically built by our API to identify the user. So this information will be returned to the Azure AD B2C, and Azure AD B2C will extract the claims from this set of tokens, and B2C will issue its own tokens to the application. So now let's see it in action. So here I have my test account, and let me open login page from the B2C. Okay, HRD API is enabled. So here is my login page, and I can click Home Realm Discovery Login. And as you can see here, there is only one text box. So here I will provide the username or email. And please remember that you can modify this behavior. So this email text box can be also displayed as a main page on the login page of the B2C. Yes? Because of the fact that I have many implementations here, I decided to just add more technical profile. So this text box is displayed once I click Login with Home Realm Discovery. So now when I click Continue, what will happen? B2C will call HRD API. HRD API will grab the information about external identity provider from the identity provider's table, and HRD API will build authorization endpoint URL and will return it to the B2C with 302 status. So B2C will make this redirection. So that's why, as you can see, here is the TechMine Factory Azure Active Directory login page, the standard one. So because of the fact that domain part was checked and also federation details were checked, like client ID for this specific endpoint, I was successfully redirected here. So now what I can do, let me sign in really quickly. And when I sign in, as you can see, underneath, obviously the code is returned again to the B2C, as you can see. Now I can decide how I will call this user. So I will call it Daniel Tester. And here in the URL, you can see the code. And now B2C will call HRD API with this code, and HRD API will exchange this code for the tokens with external identity provider, and HRD API will return its own set of tokens with the claims extracted from the tokens returned by the identity providers, external ones. So I will click Continue, and as you can see, now the ID token is returned, and as you can see, the federation partner name is TechMine Factory here. There is Daniel Tester, obviously, but you can see that external issuer is basically TechMine Factory Azure Active Directory. And obviously, I can include all the claims as I mentioned before. So I can modify those claims, remove them, add them. And also, as you can see here under IDP, there is the URL of my HRD API. You can also modify this. So this claim can be changed, and you can call this HRD API, or again, you can just provide the name of external identity provider. And still we have the issuer, so still this is the token from the B2C. So as I mentioned, we are extracting the claims from the tokens returned by external identity providers, and those claims are injected in the token that is issued by the B2C. Perfect. So this is about home realm discovery with Azure AD B2C, but I want to underline that it's not only about the Azure AD B2C, because this is based on the standards, OpenID Connect standards. So if you use any other identity provider, not only Azure AD B2C, you can still build such HRD API to delegate those federations handling on the API side. So you don't have to store it directly on your identity provider side. You can use HRD API, SQL database, and like exchange codes and tokens on the HRD API, and then return the proper information. So in the end, the home realm discovery is implemented, so you can avoid adding all the buttons on the login page. You can avoid NASCAR problem, and you can make sure that if you have more and more federations in the future, you can basically add them on the database side. So it can be beneficial, because you can try to imagine the situation where, for instance, you build the application where someone can sign in, can add the federation details, and they will land in the database. So nobody has to touch custom policies anymore. Okay, so that's it. That's about home realm discovery. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you in the next videos. Thank you.